Thank you so much, Melania, for deciding to do this with me. Afri-Canada Hub. What legacy are we leaving for our children? We are growing older. What are we passing down to them? This is of how or why Afri-Canada Hub, the idea was born. So the idea is to empower the Black child. The topic of history and how we are failing our children and not teaching them our history, our culture enough. We are not doing enough. To teach them, for them to hold strong these values that say our grandparents passed down to us and our parents have passed down to us. We need to leave something for them. Even the food we eat now has changed.
Oh yeah.
The languages we speak, now we raise our children with the westernized way of upbringing. All of these things have changed. So I like to hear your opinion on the topic of history.
Our background is teachers. We are concerned about everything about the child.
I know.
Yeah. So on the topic of history, I would just say, we just start from when I was teaching back home. I remember as soon as we got our independence, history was made an optional subject. During the time I went to school, history was compulsory. We were taught history, but I learned European history and British history.
You're not alone.
That was that. And I actually didn't do so well. To me, it didn't make sense. I didn't see the reason why I was learning this. And it was just a lot of reading and reading and reading. So I didn't like it. But I feel, children need to be taught their history. Yeah. No matter how bad it is, no matter how good it is, they need to know their history. They need to know where they are coming from.
Yeah.
There is a saying that says, history repeats itself. The same things that happened generations and generations ago, they still come back. They need to know where we are coming from, the successes and the failures. They need to know all that. History, provides an insight into our culture. What culture do we teach? If we don't know the history. Yeah. And here in Canada, I find there is the Italian community, the African community, if it's there. Yeah. I'm not affiliated to any, but there's also the Chinese community, the Filipino community. So all those communities, they should be teaching their children their history, their culture. So if we are talking about our African community, are we doing enough? Are we teaching our children our culture? Yeah.
That's a big question.
It is.
Not just in Canada, but in general, even in Africa.
Like, yes.
We now have foreigners living in Africa. Most African countries now have foreigners living in them. What sort of legacy are we leaving our children?
And you were telling me about the Mandarin being taught.
Mandarin being taught in the schools back in some of the African countries because they find themselves there. So they have to teach their children Mandarin, ways of passing on the legacy or passing on the story or the history to their children by making sure that even if they have traveled or migrated, even with migration, they are still teaching Mandarin. And here we accept everything that comes in. We accept the westernization of things, of our music, of our foods, and so on and so forth.
At the expense of our own.
At the expense of our own.
Yeah. We are accepting, Mandarin should be taught in Africa. At the same time, we are not teaching our children our own languages.
Yeah.
Yeah, so where are we going by doing that?
Yeah. So sometimes we teach the children the languages, but not in depth. See, before I remember living with a grandparent, they had the proverbs, but now they learn it in a shallow way because we want them to know English or French and sound like they are educated. And so the topic of, are you educated enough? So that's the thing. It's like, oh, if my child knows how to speak English, then it shows that they are educated. And yet we forget our own languages and the depth of it, the in-depth approach to the language. Well, so I'll move on to another question for you. I know now you are not in Zimbabwe, you are here in Canada. So often we in the diaspora find ourselves torn between two cultures. Does your new identity as a Canadian and African produce in you a double history, do you find?
Double history cannot be avoided.
Okay.
Yeah, because what is history? My history is all about me. That includes the fact that I'm here, all the things that I went through, all the challenges, all the struggles, all the successes, they are part of me. And I would be happy if my descendants, my children, and their children know all that history. Because that is what makes me. And even if we look at the Canadian or the American, the present day American or Canadians, those who came first, like from Europe, they still talk about the history back home. It's there in the schools, it's being taught. So they know, most people know where they came from. So I would also like my children to know that history. And to just digress a little, I also find, like the First Nations,
yes,
they need to know the history. And I find some of them, it's not taught. You talk about this and they are looking at you like, what are you talking about? Because it hasn't been taught to them. So it's not just us people who came, but I think everyone needs to know where they came from. They need to know what happened in their lives, how they came to be where they are.
Do you think any particular history or culture has dominance over other cultures in our time now?
For me, I would say, the beginning is always at the top. It is the dominant.
The beginning, you mean?
Where I came from.
Your heritage.
Yeah, that's my heritage. It's always, dominating. So my African heritage is dominant. My African history is dominant. And I would appreciate it if it would be passed on from one generation to the other. It is unfortunate that some of the things, like food, our kids don't eat our food, or they don't like our food.
How do you make your children like your food?
That's a very big question.
Because the food is part of the culture.
Yes, it's
part of who you are as an African descent, right? If you are passing on a culture and they are not liking the food, how? Because that's a big part of it.
My own children, that's not a problem because they came.
They were not born here.
Yeah. But I feel for those who have young ones, just to introduce it slowly. If you overwhelm them with it, they might not like it. Embed them. Maybe that way. And also teach them how to prepare it. That's another thing. They may not like it because they don't know how to cook it. They don't know how to prepare it. You just introduce it, gradually, bits by bits.
Do you think passing down our history should be something we celebrate at home? Say, maybe cooking and making it like a little celebration in the house and say, you're cooking this food, or today is this festival back in the homeland, and so we replicate the same type of thing. Would that be a way to teach our children our history, our culture?
It's another way of doing it. Yep. If you want to, say, teach your language, you want your kids to learn their language, you can find a teacher for your children, and then you approach the government and say, I want my children to be taught my language, and I have a teacher for that. And that teacher can be paid by the government.
Is it an option for the government to pay for those private?
Yeah, it's an option.
It's an option.
Yeah, it's an option. Or you can come together as a group and say, our children need to learn their language. So let's find a teacher, and they're there. And then they look at all the qualifications, if they qualify, and then they can teach your children your language. And that way they're also teaching the history.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you.
So, thank you so much for joining me and
You're welcome.
Canada Hub.